All right, so this is my, I think, first presentation in the Zoom era. I've taught quite a number of classes um, over Zoom since COVID, but I haven't participated in a conference using a Zoom format. So we'll see how this goes. I agree with Arnold from the first presentation that to me it's very counterintuitive not to be in person, sharing space, um, all in the same room together. So it's going to take some adaptation. Um, there's my content information up there. Happy to hear from anybody to discuss the presentation and the article. And I'm at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. That's my primary institution currently. Here in Alabama, in Birmingham, which, inspired by Carlos's example, is located on the traditional lands of the Muskogee or Creek Native American people, First Nation of North America. So the first item I've got here, and can everybody see my presentation? The screen with the teaching aesthetics dancing at the top. If you can't, if anybody can't, just let me know. Say something in the chat or get my attention, and I'll be happy to tweak as needed. So the first thing that I wanted to share was when I was reading the abstracts, all the interesting abstracts for the other presenters, I was struck that my abstract did not quite fit in a couple different ways. And it seemed generally like maybe I had been approaching it, thinking of it more in like a general typical academic conference kind of a frame, and less so with the more accessible orientation and the teaching aesthetics focus. But those two things are very important to me: accessibility and teaching and pedagogy. So I wanted to try to do justice to that. So I have significantly modified the presentation I'm trying to give from what you might anticipate from the abstract that was written if you looked at it. The good thing about it is, as I've gotten down here, the journal article that this talk was originally based on and still largely based on is available for free on academia.edu and other sources, other places. So feel free to read the whole thing and share your thoughts. Be happy to hear them. So one thing that dance is good for is this kind of tendency, especially in Africana dance traditions, Afro-Latin traditions like the one I'm going to be talking about today. Is improvisation and spontaneity, being adaptive and creative in real time. A second thing that I think is good and helpful about incorporating dance into teaching aesthetics is that it's admirably practical. It's arguably the most embodied of the traditional arts compared to the classical arts that philosophers have concerned ourselves with: painting, poetry, sculpture, architecture, music. Dance is arguably more embodied or more vividly embodied than those other art forms. And so it's a helpful medium form, in my view, for thinking about embodiment and thinking about practical considerations. So in the interest of that, or trying to take advantage of that, performing the thing that I'm advocating that other folks do by incorporating more dance into their aesthetics teaching. There are three issues I wanted to touch on before pivoting directly to Vodou. So the first is Palestine. We're in the Kafia here, as y'all may have noticed. My fiance was actually born in Palestine herself and immigrated to the United States. And so this is a close and personal issue for me. I very much appreciated Carlos's remarks during his presentation, which I strongly second. And the current numbers, the last I've seen, although these are changing, by the hour, is 8,000 people, 8,000 Palestinians, half of whom in Gaza are children under 18, have been killed by Israel. And those who have not been killed yet are still living under apartheid as attested by, among other international bodies, Amnesty International. So talking about revolution, talking about social justice, talking about oppression in a Haitian context, talking about decolonialism. And as Carlos said, it seemed irresponsible, unethical, politically problematic not to make a gesture, at least in the direction of the ongoing genocide, that we must do all that we can to try to undermine and prevent, as well as the apartheid that lies behind it. Secondly, also more directly connected to the subject of Vodou, as Vodou comes from Western and Central Africa, is the ongoing crisis in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where, according to the BBC, yesterday, I think is when I got this source, 6.9 million people have been internally displaced by escalating violence, especially in the east of the country. So this is something that's, I think, starting to get a bit more media attention in the West, but not nearly enough given the scope of the crisis. I believe it's now the second largest instance of displaced peoples after Ukraine. And third, and this one came to my mind because the forum is teaching aesthetics. And even though I've taught for 20 years now in the academy, and I've taught dancing for almost 30 years before getting into academic philosophical teaching, I've taught this long, but I've never had an opportunity to teach aesthetics or the philosophy of art as its own standalone course, largely because for most of those 20 years, I've been an adjunct professor. I was tenure track assistant professor in the CUNY system for 2 years, but unable to live in New York City on the salary that was paid. So then I moved over to New Jersey for 2 more years on the tenure track. But then COVID hit and half of the faculty, the tenure track faculty, were laid off with the administration citing COVID. So aside from those 4 years, mostly I've been an adjunct faculty member. And as for most of us, and it's most professors in the United States at least, it's roughly 70% of academic faculty are contingent, temporary, precariously employed by our universities. And we do most of the vegetables teaching among philosophy courses and humanities courses. It's mostly the tenured professors that do the higher courses with the more specific subject matter. So what I'm talking about and trying to think about this in the context of teaching aesthetics is, for me personally, largely speculative, imagined, although I have, other folks have noted today, managed to incorporate a teaching of aesthetics and of the arts, and a little bit of dance even, in the course of my regular teaching, including, in my case, an example of an intro to philosophy course in grad school. My second grad school, we were encouraged as grad students to pick a theme that might be more interesting or exciting to the undergraduates whom we were teaching intro to philosophy to. And I did a different theme each semester that I taught that course. And one year I taught the course on philosophy as dance. So that's been my most extensive experience with teaching dance aesthetics, specifically in an academic setting. Okay. And there's the link to the full article, Tornadic Black Angels, Vodou Dance Revolution. So before shifting to hopefully a more discussion-oriented question and answer related ideas format, which is my preference in my regular teaching and in conference presentations. And I'm confident if Valerie is still awake after this, that he and I at least can keep the conversation going for a while. But from this article, I talk about, broadly speaking, Vodou's past, and Vodou's present and Vodou's potential future possibilities. And I thought since that's a 26-page long full journal article, that it would probably be too much, especially given the desire to focus on teaching aesthetics, to go through all three aspects in detail. So I thought the one that was least likely to be familiar to folks in general who might be interested in the subject and teaching aesthetics would be the past. Generally, I think that's the area where we're least experienced, least aware, just from the historical distance. So starting off with Vodou's past, and Vodou, by the way, is just an alternate spelling of what's usually, in a US context at least, that's how I heard it, spelled voodoo, like Voodoo, and pronounced voodoo. And there's like a long, complicated, racist history in places like Alabama, where I'm from and currently located, of using this term in a very derogatory way. And so it's in part because of that derogatory usage that scholars of Neo-Africana religions like Vodou have made, to me, persuasive arguments for adopting this more traditional French based spelling and pronunciation of the term as a way to recapture, re-signify a more respectful and dignity enhancing way of thinking about this Neo-Africana religious practice. So there is a popular Haitian saying, according to my primary source for the past third of the article about Vodou's past. Kate Ramsey is the scholar's name. The saying goes, law always has a trap inside of it. Which is interesting also if you think about the etymological origins of law and legality in an English context. Ligare, a Latin basis, meaning to bind, to restrict, constrict. So arguably this popular saying gets at the heart of something that's conceptually central to the law in general, that there's something about the law that's binding, that's restrictive, something that you should be wary of, just in general, perhaps, let alone in a colonized setting, such as present-day Haiti, what is now present-day Haiti. Also, another linguistic etymological point that Ramsey takes full advantage of in her analysis is that loi, the French word for law, sounds a lot like, looks a bit like the word for Vodou spirits, Loa, LWA is the usual transliteration here. So Loa and Loa, phonetically, sonically very close terms. And this becomes, in some ways, the guiding figure or motif for Ramsey's analysis, is to think of the French colonizing law, the loi, and the religious practices of Vodou, the Loa, as being, in some sense, opposing legal systems in a broader sense, but not that much broader sense of law, as opposed to the way that Vodou is typically thought of in terms of French and other colonizing cultures, namely as something that's irrational, something that's quote unquote primitive, something that is emotional as opposed to rational. It tends to get put on the negative side of these various often dehumanizing dichotomies in a scholarly and a larger cultural context. So as opposed to thinking of the law as being something that's formal and that is colonizing and that is French, and the law as being faced with something fundamentally irrational and religious, instead, it's a intentionally strategic thinking of the two as on a level playing field. There's something equal fundamentally about these two systems. And by doing that, by thinking of it that way, it makes it easier to recognize the full and fundamental humanity and dignity of the various indigenous and Africana traditions that go into Vodou, and that helped materially, according to Kate Ramsey and others, overturn the colonial oppression in what is now Haiti. So the first of three primary steps in this history that Ramsey gives us is that the subset of Vodou called Petwo Vodou, which is connected to black magic, and this is a phrase that's debatable and controversial, but used by various actors, including Haitian people and practitioners of Vodou themselves, is consciously deployed in the Haitian Revolution. So, broadly speaking, there's two primary schools, is not the exact right word, but two kind of sub-traditions within Vodou that are most influential. And one is considered more benevolent and healing and neutral and safe and respectable, the Rada rites. And then on the other hand, there is the Petwo, which is associated more with aggressiveness and with militancy and with political resistance. And this is sometimes conceptualized as white magic versus black magic. And according to Ramsey, among others, Vodou practitioners, including Vodou priests and priestesses, deliberately and self-consciously used this aspect of Vodou to help achieve their goals in overthrowing the colonial regime during the Haitian Revolution. So the first step, and this is where dance becomes central, even though I think most people, at least in the United States, in my experience and in the scholarship, in my research, most folks in those contexts don't tend to think about Vodou and dance as connected. So going against that common sense is the history, wherein the first uses of anything like the word Vodou in a Haitian context are when Africana religious dances brought with the enslaved peoples from Western and Central Africa. Those dances were lumped together by the colonizing powers, by the French and others, and indiscriminately labeled with this term Vodou. So Vodou meant any one of these number of dances that were visibly recognizable as of a Black Africana origin and were perceived as such a threat in some form or other that they were actually outlawed. So this is the first time when the loi, right, the laws, and the loa, the spirits, come into explicit conflict. And it's the law, it's the French law that is firing the first shot, as colonizers always do. Quote from Ramsey here, there is a, quote, wide scholarly consensus that during the revolution, magico-religious beliefs served to mobilize resistance and foster a revolutionary mentality, end quote. So this is, we have to be careful because this comes later, right? The first thing that happens is various dances, which may or may not have any internal connection to each other, are put into a new category by the colonizing authorities and called Vodou. So that's the first step, a renaming, a recategorization, and that's taken by the colonizers. But as a second step, that new phenomenon, that new colonizer labeled phenomenon of Vodou, that cluster of dances, is then self-consciously deployed by the practitioners of those dances, by the people who practice what evolves into what becomes known as Vodou in their own fight for liberation and struggle. So regardless of the origin, regardless of the validity or accuracy in terms of dance, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of Africana culture, of that initial step, no matter how that happened, it remains the case that once that resource was there, problematic though it was, the soon to be self-liberated Haitian people use that resource. They weaponized, in other words, this admittedly artificial category or concept in order to achieve their own social justice seeking political revolutionary ends. This came to be understood by the French authorities and other Western commentators, and problematically in the example of a supposed belief of invulnerability, of immunity from injury or death on the part of the people fighting for their independence, fighting for their freedom. This idea that an artifact with magical significance could somehow shield a fighter on the Haitian side from harm or death. So it was typically seen in this disrespectful, infantilizing way of a quote unquote primitive magical belief, but it could also easily be understood more charitably, more respectfully, as the people who would become the Haitian people were tapping into their own religious and cultural resources, the creativity of what was becoming Vodou, and using that psychologically, existentially, spiritually, to empower themselves, to fight more bravely, to take risks, to make sacrifices as needed to achieve the goals of the revolution. So one famous example, now this is shifting from myths to actual historical case, concerns, quote, this is a quote from Ramsey again, a landowner of color, possibly of Spanish descent, who was named Romain Riviere, but called himself Romain la Prophetess. This transgender prophetess, quote, attracted a following of thousands of rebels when he announced that the king had already emancipated the slaves and that he himself was the godson of the Virgin Mary, with whom he was in direct communication, end quote, according to La Prophetess themselves. So a perhaps to most of us startlingly modern, postmodern, transgender figure of social justice, liberation, revolution, self-consciously and creatively tapping into these new and reworked Africana, Neo-African religious traditions and channeling that into the cause of the revolution. So this is step one, is to summarize again, contrary to what we might imagine, dance is at the core and at the origin of what Vodou is, historically speaking, arguably also conceptually speaking, structurally speaking. And as such, the dancing practice of Vodou was directly, causally, massively influential in the fight for Haitian independence. It's the point of the first of these three moments from the history. Second point from Ramsey: the newly liberated leaders of Haiti also immediately moved to outlaw Vodou. So another reason, and as someone who has done a lot of research in the history of philosophy, the history of aesthetics, and the history of the philosophy of dance and dance aesthetics, I've learned from frustrating experience that in many cases, because dance and the people that we associate with dance in Western history, which is to say women, people of color, children, most than adults, non-human animals, the pollen dance of the honeybee, for example, queer people as opposed to straight people, including trans people. The people that we associate with dance, again, fall on the persecuted, pejorative side of these various dichotomies in Western history. And perhaps as a result, dance is taken less seriously in the history of philosophy. And so direct engagement with canonical philosophers and dance is relatively rare. So as a scholar looking into this, one has to look more for indirect indicators and traces, the effects of dance on a particular thinker, the effects of dance on a particular tradition, on a religion. So the evidence is there, but it's often indirect and takes a bit more work to bring it into view. Like Monica's roots in the classroom experiment from the earlier presentation today. Okay, so an example of that, the reason I mention that now, is that you can infer, it seems to me, from the fact that one of the first things that the new leaders of the newly independent nation state of Haiti did was to outlaw Vodou. You can infer from this, to me surprising at the time, decision, is that Vodou did indeed have considerable power, right? The French outlawed it, perhaps because they saw the potential for organization, for mobilization, for psychological existential empowerment in these practices, and rightly saw it as the threat to its power that it became, right, as it went on to help empower the revolution. Just so, immediately after having gained their freedom and the new government gaining its power, the new leaders seemed to also recognize and acknowledge and validate that power of the dance-centered practice of Vodou. Otherwise, they wouldn't have outlawed it themselves, right? It was so powerful that it overturned one deeply, deeply unjust regime, the colonizing regime. But maybe the Haitian leaders perhaps thought it'll keep overturning things, right? How do we know that Vodou is done stirring up trouble? How do we know that these dancers and these dancing priests aren't going to also turn on us? Especially if, as many scholars conclude, those early and many later leaders in Haiti's history were significantly unjust and corrupt, and therefore justifiably fearful of the protests and the resistance of the people. So, turning to the quote here, the former revolutionaries, having benefited from both hands of Vodou, the right good hand of the Rada rights and the left bad hand of the Petwo rights, now sought to outlaw the rebellious left hand of Petwo, and ended up technically outlawing also the right hand, including the dances that the Haitian people have never surrendered despite centuries of its oppression. So what I'm saying here, what Ramsey delineates, is that these laws, both the French colonial laws and the later Haitian laws, formal laws, because of their vagueness, because of their imprecision, and perhaps because of the fear that may have underlay those laws, they weren't careful enough. They didn't make this distinction, which to many, if not most, Vodou practitioners historically is absolutely central: the left hand and the right hand, the Rada and the Petwo, the good and the bad, the white and the black magic. It did not, these laws did not respect that distinction. And so they ended up using these terms that apply technically to the left hand and the right hand. And in doing so, they confused and deeply angered the people of Haiti, who were very attached to especially the Rada rights, and who rightly and justifiably saw them as more oriented towards healing, towards individual well-being, towards peace, towards stability. It was unclear to them, because it was not logical. Government, any people in power would want to write laws outlawing what was obviously a good and peaceful and healing and divine thing. So the pragmatic understanding that the Haitian people reached was that this was just an issue of ignorance, of incompetence, right? That surely the Haitian leaders did not intend to actually outlaw the Rada rights, the healing rights. So they just acted for the most part whenever they could on the assumption that, Petwo is problematic, maybe it's inherently aggressive, maybe there's things about so-called black magic that should be resisted, should be avoided. It's definitely considered something by Vodou practitioners as risky, inherently a risky kind of thing to engage in. So just stay away from the things that your religion, that Vodou tells you probably you should treat with care anyway and avoid whenever possible. Stay away from that, but go ahead and engage in the things that everyone knows are not only harmless but also helpful and healing. So that's the way that most Haitian people throughout its history have tended to deal with that strange legal infrastructure, is to selectively interpret it, to interpret it charitably as not hitting the mark that it's aiming for, and therefore continue practicing their other rites in secret or openly, depending on the risk aversion tolerance of the practitioner. So finally, from this history, the third step that Kate Ramsey talks about is that Vodou later empowered resistance to the US occupation of Haiti, an occupation that doesn't get much discussion. I don't know if I've ever encountered it growing up in the United States. I don't know if any textbook, any history book talked about our occupation of Haiti, but went on for 20 years, from 1914 to 1934. So having resisted the French effectively and even achieving independence, and then having resisted their own leaders when they were unjust and corrupt and tried to limit their religious freedoms, now Vodou's practitioners, the Haitian people, used Vodou to resist another colonizing post-colonial power. So more specifically, among the most effective forms of Haitian Vodou resistance were: 1, counterintelligence that advertised a false postponement of a given dance ceremony, which was moved to another Onfo temple that same night. 2, drums used during the service or services, which were stuffed with cotton fiber in order to muffle their volume. And 3, many Vodou priests becoming part of the policing structure themselves. More specifically, there's a widespread practice that Ramsey analyzes, wherein Vodou priests would become official, like, police informants. They would present themselves as trying to help the police and the US military occupiers stamp out Vodou and keep the bad people in line, especially the Petwo practitioners. But then they use that position, use their ties with the local police and the military in order to actually help warn their fellow practitioners, the members of their flock, to practice more effectively in secret. So they exploited, in a resistant and politically effective way, this kind of inside-outside status that they occupied when they were working for the police. So I do want to briefly touch on the second and third parts of the article, which again is there if you want to learn more about it in detail. But broadly speaking, in Vodou's present, which is also in the diaspora, including in the United States, including New York. The book I rely on mostly here is called Mama Lola, a Vodou priestess in Brooklyn. And it's a fascinating read, ethnography. It's in its 3rd edition now, critically acclaimed, one of the first quote unquote postmodern ethnographies, according to the author. And again, there's not time to get into it in detail, but the most important development that I see happening both in the practice of this Haitian immigrant, Haitian American Vodou priestess in Brooklyn herself, Mama Lola, in her practice, as ethnographer details it, and in that methodological orientation, like the frame of reference and the analysis that the ethnographer brings to bear on it. What I see is that dance, first of all, is eliminated. So there's virtually no dance in the entire book. And the author talks about this, and that ethnographer's name is Karen McCarthy Brown, by the way. Didn't make it onto the outline. Brown talks about how this has to do largely with practical issues. So given the place where Mama Lola lives, and she does her Vodou work out of her apartment, a crowded apartment with multiple family members in Brooklyn. She doesn't have the space, and she doesn't have the resources, and she's worried about noise complaints and getting kicked out of her apartment. So she can't afford, in various senses, to use drums. And without the drums, the dancing falls by the wayside too. So there's very limited instances of dance, including Mama Lola dancing during various ceremonies. But it doesn't have anything like the central value that it has in the history of Vodou that Kate Ramsey details. So dance is taken away from it, from Vodou, in this picture, in this practice, and in this picture of the practice that Brown gives us. And instead it's reduced to arguably specifically a middle-class white self-care version of healing, a kind of a new age idea of using various religious traditions in order to be more at peace, more at home in the postmodern world. And in this way, I argue, Vodou in Mama Lola's practice, at least as it's captured in Brown's ethnography, is distorted away from it's distorted towards, interpersonal ethical pacification. It's an ethical thing, not a political thing. It's a one-on-one thing. It's a peace thing, and away from the kind of political transformation that we see at the origins of Vodou, most dramatically in its role, its various effects in the Haitian Revolution. So I'm suggesting that something, a lot has been lost, and that the marginalizing and subtraction of dance from Vodou is intimately connected to the loss of this political communal resistance dimension that's so important in Haiti, in Vodou's history. And finally, for dance and Vodou's potential future, dancers' actions for a limited time in a circumscribed performance space directly and profoundly transform the entire community's actions across and beyond its boundaries and for all future time. And this is from, drawing here in the third part, from the Black dance anthropologist Yvonne Daniel, a book called Dancing Wisdom, Embodied Knowledge in Haitian Vodou, Cuban Yoruba, and Bahian Candomblé. And she talks at length about connecting the experience of an embodied dancing body, and especially, particularly someone racialized as she is with her origins, tapping into that dance experience in connection with practices like Santeria and Vodou and Candomblé. And it gestures to me in the direction of the possibility of a sort of reconnecting of the spiritual and the political, of a reaching out beyond the individual to the communal. In the case of Vodou, a kind of a homecoming between the Rada and the Petwo rites, as opposed to the segregation of the two and the lifting up of the Rada as the good healing white magic, and the denigration of the Petwo as simply negative, quote unquote, black magic. And then I talk about how this could be useful in social justice change, revolutionary aspirations in our world today, as we continue in various ways to resist colonization and to work towards decolonizing ourselves and our communities and the globe. So I'm going to pause here for a second and gauge little audience here So something that I prepared in case, this is just an in case thing. You may have noticed on the sheet, I got a YouTube link to A Pedir Su Mano, to ask for your hand, from Juan Luis Guerra, who's one of the most famous popular musicians in the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic. Merengue is the style of music and dance that he's most associated with, and this is a merengue dance. So I have done presentations where we dance together at the end of it. So I'm not just talking about dancing, but actually doing it. But again, this experience was in person. We were, there in the same room. I'm not sure. So I'm open to doing this again. We can play it. On my computer here and see if that works, or we can try to like sync it up simultaneously. I'm not an expert in this aspect of Zooming, but that's only if people have an interest in learning a little bit of merengue. Learning is a stretch. You just walk, essentially, but
let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay, all right.
Los yayanes en una yagua de tul, voy a pintar los manantiales como leo de cielo azul. Voy a prender tu cariñito como cocuyo en el mar y voy a hacerte un traje novia como es del platanal. Yeah, yeah. Mira, baby, mi mano viene. Vamos sola y unos palos.
Not everyone knows. Okay, so as you make it see the video, you're just walking back and forth, left, right, kind of like you're grinding something in the dirt. You just bend your hips forward naturally. That white person hips like me, don't try to make them do it.
Y cuando tengas tu permiso voy a volar norte a sur para buscar arriba el pico, el nido que quieras tú. Yeah, yeah. Voy a prender tu cariñito como cocuyo en el mar y voy a hacerte un traje novia como hojas del Playa. Vamos sola y unos palos para que me quieras por siempre, que su amor sea verdadero para que me quieras hoy. Mira, baby, mi mano viene. Vamos sola y unos palos para que me quieras por siempre, pa' yo prender mi lucero para que me quieras. Mira, baby, mi mano viene.
Now we got it, clearly. It's anybody else, but
Oh, oh, yeah. Pa' yo prender mi lucero pa' que me quieras. Oh, oh, yeah.
all right, okay. Thanks very much for the audience participation. You guys are brave, braver than I would be. Okay, so happy to discuss. Thanks.
Thanks, Joshua. It was perfect. I've never danced. I know, maybe last time I danced at 6 a.m. was at a rave party when I was 21.
There you go. Now we're talking.
I have something to ask you about, just to connect dancing voodoo and 3 points that you raised in the very beginning. All the bloody disasters we go through, leaving aside the academic side of things, obviously. So the question is about protests, right? There's so many protests around, even in Australia, which is still in a state of slumber. There's like 100,000 people and so on. I'm not sure how effective they are, right, in terms of whether they affect the real stakeholders, right? People who make decisions.
Yeah.
So my question is, obviously protests are devoid of any artistic or aesthetic component as such, conscious, designed. So do you think protests of such magnitude, 10,000 people, 50,000 people, would have a dramatically, categorically different impact if people approach them in this way or in a similar way, something that incorporates their bodies as well, not just as tools for, you know, screaming and yelling out, yelling the soul out, but as a vehicle for a different kind of message?
Well, yeah, I think have been viciously divided, right? The artistic dimension has been removed from it, and the political dimension has been removed from our art, from our practices. So the first time that I was listening to Vodou music, I thought it was salsa. It was so similar. And then I was asking my friend from one of my friends from Cuba about it. You know, was there any connection that he was aware of between these two things? Like, oh yeah, it's like the same stuff. And turns out he has like this instrument, this traditional Cuban Santeria, so another neo-African religion, very similar to Vodou in various ways. He has like a Santeria religious musical instrument that he would like walk around the dance floor and he would shake that instrument, and it was like he was engaging in a ceremonial performance. He just didn't tell anybody, me included. Something that I thought was meaningful. We had a couple of, there's an immigrant rights organization here in Alabama called Adelante, and they were working hard to get these two members of theirs who were immigrants from Guatemala. They had been unjustly detained by ICE, and they were being held indefinitely. And so Adelante organized a protest, and me and some other members of the Birmingham Philosophy Guild, our local community philosophy group, we were invited to join, and we joined with them. And we marched around this prison, and people brought all these various Caribbean musical instruments, and they played music, and we sang, and we danced. And it was this very like affectively, existentially, potentially spiritually, for different individuals, intense experience. And I just feel like that has been missing from a lot of the protests that I've gone to, not all of them. But yeah, I think if we can find a way to challenge the segregation of these aspects of our life and of our being, if we can reintegrate them, including reintegrating things like secular salsa dancing and the neo-African religions that gave birth to that form of dance, then I think that will make our protests and our other political actions much more effective.
So I have like two questions. The first one is, have you considered the cultural aspect of, well, the relation between dancing and all the rituals, Afro rituals, in terms of, for example, like we learn to dance since we are children. So we are not taking classes, for example, and and in many countries, well, Caribbean or some Latin Americans, for example, well, in Brazil, people are like used to dance and link it with the rituals. In Cuba, for example, the Santeria is really like linked with certain kind of dances, and all the rituals are dancing. And have you considered that aspect? And the other question is related with what Valerie asked, because I remember like with the last protests in Puerto Rico, that they were very, very related with reggaeton, and like all the protests were like really linked with, in relation with reggaeton, and reggaeton was resignified in terms of protest, and not like the misogynist dance that like Western view can can sanction, no, this kind of dancing. And I think, I must suspect, it's the same in Brazil, for example, no, like all these traditional and ritualistic Yoruba traditions that are like really part of the culture and part of the religions, also are part of the dancing in a bar, but at the same time in a protest, no, like it's
yeah, absolutely. So one thing, a lot of thoughts here. One thing that strikes me, I think you're touching on a little bit with like the bar. So most Afro-Latin social dance in the US that I've experienced and a little bit overseas, it takes place in bars and restaurants and clubs, and it's often kind of hypersexualized. That's the assumption that that's what dancing like that is going to be like, and then that's the expectation. And often there's like a fetishizing of certain people and certain bodies in those spaces, especially from like non-Latinx people who might be coming to those events. And it contrasts for me with like house parties that I went to when I was in grad school in Pennsylvania. We would have house parties. And one thing that I really liked about those spaces was that they were multi-generational. There were little kids there. There would be like grandparents there, all these different generations. And it was much more kind of community, neighborly, family. There was food, you know, and there was dancing and there was talking. It wasn't just dance, and it wasn't just like young single people.